Okay, well, welcome, and thank you for being here, Bruce. I know you've got to be busy. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We have a disclaimer that we would like to read, and it reads as this. RARE, as a nonprofit charity, does not support or oppose individual candidates running for public office. RARE invited both candidates for mayor of the city of Seattle to speak to our group for educational purposes. Our plan is for both candidates to be given equal time to speak and answer the same questions. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We have them divided up into categories, and the first section is personal questions. And this is the question. Bruce, how has your ethnic heritage prepared you for life in general, including your journey into politics?
Well, thank you, Naja, and thank you, Rare, for spending a few moments this evening. I apologize, I was a few minutes late, even though I was in the waiting room for a while. So to answer your question directly, I was a product of Seattle Public Schools, T.T. Minor, Meany, and Garfield, then to the University of Washington. And I think many of you know I'm of mixed heritage. My father was an African-American, originally from Louisiana. And my mother, Japanese-American, who was born here and went to Bailey Gatchert and Garfield. They met at Garfield. And they were married their entire life. And so what they told me as a young man is that, being biracial, I was a minority within minorities, that during the height of the civil rights movement, I wasn't quite sure where I fit in. I mean, it was blacks and whites and browns and yellows. And when you're biracial, you sort of look for the common denominator in people. I've been burned by all kind of people, black, white, yellow, brown. I've been loved by all kind of people. And my work in equity basically forces me to look for the goodness in everybody. My wife is an African-American, originally from Washington, D.C. We raised 3 children. Many of you know I've spent a lifetime in the communities of color. I'm currently chairman of the board of the Royal Esquire Club. I'm president of the Central Area Development Association, an African-American housing affordability provider for 30 years. I was president of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. I'm a member of the Japanese American leadership delegation. So my work has been in equity. Quite frankly, the black folks in my family, they came here for jobs and opportunity and economic prosperity, as did my Japanese roots. And so I will be the mayor that truly fights across all communities, make sure that we build that pathway. And I always tell people on my far political left that people of color don't need saviors. We need resources. We need impediments out of the way, and we'll take it from there. And so my message is quite distinct from my opponents, because when I talk about empowering communities, I talk about that, empowering communities. That's what you're going to see if I become mayor, a whole new discussion on race and social justice. We'll talk about what we have in common as we celebrate our differences.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, question number 2. As you observe what is happening around the world and in your own communities regarding racial equity, what are your thoughts and reflections, both personally and professionally? What personal steps have you taken to mitigate racial inequity and social injustice?
Yeah, well, everywhere I go, I will suggest that in Seattle, liberal, compassionate Seattle, we still have our soft underbelly of racism. That growing up in the Central District, quite frankly, where Roosevelt was, we were a little afraid to go to the North End. We were afraid to go to Ballard, especially at dark. And I learned as I became more mature that it's okay. I have friends all over the city. So what I do is I'll give you a specific example. That I was talking to, there's been 8 polls done in this race, and I've been first in every poll. I placed first in 15 people that ran in the primary. And my candidacy crosses across all neighborhoods. And I was at a forum, actually a meeting 2 weeks ago. There's no diversity in the room. And when I mean that, there wasn't even a woman in the room. They're all younger white males, and they were in the leasing agent, commercial leasing business, all fine young men. And I mean young men, by the way, because they were all in their 30s or 40s, which is young to me. And I said, how many of you golf? And every hand went up, and I'm not a golfer. And as we talked about public safety issues and downtown revitalization, small business growth, which is the focus of the hour, and they are all supportive of my candidacy, I said, I'm going to ask you to basically adopt and mentor some young people of color that go to Rainier Beach High School and Cleveland and Franklin and other schools in our system. And I'm going to ask you to teach them how to golf because they're all golfers. But I said, I want the relationship that they need to know your industry. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in people from all backgrounds to mentor and love and coach the younger people of different demographics. And that's how I go about equity. The fact of the matter is my first coach, and I was on a football scholarship at the University of Washington. A lot of people don't know that my first coach was white. It was a University of Washington crew, a guy in the crew. I don't even know what you call them, crew guys. He's still a good friend and he's in his latter 80s, but he was my first coach. He loved me like I was his own son. I've had mentors from all colors. And so we're going to change the conversation to one of love and mentorship. And that's how we're going to solve many of our major problems. But we will also celebrate our cultural richness. And so we don't lose that in the process. So that's what my equity fight is going to be all about.
Okay, thank you. All right, question number 3, still in the personal questions category. There's been a lot of racial tension in the last year and a half. Based on your personal experience, what words of encouragement would you offer for someone who is still struggling in the midst of racism and has lost hope?
I would say to that person that that I grew up in an era, I'm going to just say hypothetically, because they could be of any ethnic background, any person of color, they could be anything. But I will give them my experience that I grew up in an era where we didn't say Black Lives Matter. We said Black is beautiful. We said Black power. And we said, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. That, and I've said this publicly, that when we embrace the Black Lives Matter movement, which really is a means to eradicate racism and unreasonable force and murderous force by a police department, as we embrace Black Lives Matter, yeah, we more than matter. You more than matter. You are the product of kings and queens. You are the inventors of technology. You are the inventors of health, revolutionary advancements in health. You should be prideful of who you are and where you had come from. And so we will say Black is beautiful. And if I have to teach people how to self-love, that's what I do. There's a curriculum called Increasing Human Effectiveness, where you look at your impediments in front of you, whatever are the internal messaging to yourself, that perhaps I don't matter. Perhaps I have low self-esteem. Perhaps my mother or father told me I wouldn't amount to anything. I don't know the impediments, but we're going to lock those impediments. And that's how you build hope. That was done to me. So, and I know you don't hear Mayoral candidates talk about this stuff, but there's a reason why, I graduated #1 in my class or on the dean's list in grad school, or I was able to be a chief counsel of a major corporation and city council president 2 terms. I have a standard of excellence in my life that came from my parents instilling a belief in me. And I want to instill that same belief in others, particularly when they don't get that positive messaging at home.
Okay, that's a good segue into the next question, number 4, and this is from Reginald Ball. Where should the starting point be to introduce the reality of racial equity? School, home, visual or print media, or all of the above?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's clearly all of the above. I used to tell some young folks, I'll give you a good example. I think it's sort of funny. I said, if you turn off the volume on your television, and just hypothetically, I want you all to think about this example, and you just see around a table 3 white guys in suits talking. You don't know what they're talking about and just looking at each other talking. And now you flip the script and you see 3 African Americans, same age, men, just talking. And then you do it with women, just talking. And I ask you, just honestly, you don't even have to verbalize the answer, what do you think they're talking about? And then the stereotypes come. And you will think they will say, and the data is clear on this, this is actually a study that was done, that they will assume the three African Americans were talking about sports, the three white guys were talking about business or Wall Street or the NASDAQ or the Dow. And they were thinking about women were talking about non-business related things. And you see these stereotypes are formed subconsciously by what they see every day, the imagery. We have to reverse all of that. There's a program at Microsoft called DigiGirls where they're teaching girls at a young age that you can code just as well as guys, and you see tracks in their life. So to answer Reggie's question, the issue of self-esteem has come from everywhere. And where there are deficiencies, the deficiencies in home, they should get it in school. And if it's not taught in school, it should be taught in social media. This is going to be an all hands on deck approach because that's how we're going to change the narrative of how people see themselves. And when you see yourself differently, you start behaving differently. You always act in alignment with your belief system about yourself, always. And so if we change that belief system about yourself from all those sources, they will start acting in alignment with that belief system about themselves.
Okay, thank you. The next question, number 5, is going to be in the category of City of Seattle / government. And we have a young lady who is going to pose her question to you herself. Alexis.
Hi, my name is Alexis Brew. I'm a member of the NAACP Youth Council and Washington Epic Studies Now. My question is, what measures of accountability do you plan to enforce for people in leadership roles of power, i.e. public office, the police force, etc., who have harmed people of color and or perpetuated racist and discriminatory behaviors and systems?
Thanks for that question. And a little context, before I'd started running for office, I was on the executive committee at the NAACP. And to answer your question directly, first of all, I was the one that passed the bias-free policing law. And I also passed the legislation to make way for body cameras because I wanted an accurate record in terms of police accountability. I want to know who's being racial profiled. I want to look at the data, who's being issued traffic tickets and why. And so the first thing we will do to establish accountability is measure. I also put money in the budget to test housing practices, who's being quoted higher rates, lower rates, same-sex couples, racial couples, disability couples. So we have to not only make sure we have the right laws under RCW 4960, which are state law of discrimination, our city ordinances. We have to not only make sure that we have the right laws, we have to measure it, we have to test it. So you're going to see under my leadership, not only do we change the laws to make sure they're cutting edge with respect to eradicating racism, but you'll see us test it and measure it and train people. That's the only way you know if it's working. We're starting what's called a race and data initiative, which is going to double down on how we measure and change behavior while we measure. So that's how we're going to get it done.
Thank you. And Alexis, thank you for your question. The next question, number 6, Bruce, is from Bruce Williams. And his question is, if you are mayor, do you think you can make a meaningful difference in Seattle's racial equity climate during your term in office? If so, how will you do that? And what will be the biggest barriers?
So yes, I will be able to do that. And I would not have run for office after I retired if I didn't think I could achieve that. How I will get it done, number one, is you may recall I was the one that passed a race and social justice initiative that the city's done for it. I solely sponsored that legislation because, first of all, the people who mostly are affected, they have to be at the table. And so under my leadership, you will see an extremely diverse cabinet, starting with my deputy mayors, my department heads, and management ranks. I believe, quite frankly, I've been the 4th person to be elected city council president twice. And many of my direct reports were primarily people of color. And I believe that we know how to recruit, particularly in our communities. And I started an organization called Performance First when I was a member of the Puget Sound Regional Council Executive Board. And what Performance First said is, for minority businesses, I said, you don't have to give us work because we're black, brown, or yellow, or people of color. Evaluate us on our performance first. And that was our name, Performance First, because we know how to, we're lean business owners. We know how to read a balance sheet and sharpen a pencil. give us the relationships that we've been deprived of, relationship capital. So in my leadership, I will share relationship capital with as many people who want it. I have some pretty powerful relationships in this city. That's just the truth of the matter. I could call most people on my phone. I've worked hard for that. My wife was the first African-American and the first woman president of United Way. That's a $100 million organization. She's served in many CEO positions. She serves as the Board of Regents at the University of Washington as an African-American woman. So the fact of the matter is I have relationships, and we will use those relationships and leverage them for people who have been disadvantaged and have not had those relationships. That's how we're going to change equity, by the way. I said earlier, we don't need saviors. We don't need heroes. We just need the right relationships and the right resources. That's how we're going to move the needle.
Thank you. The next section we're going to move to is about housing. And question number 8, we're going to let Alexis ask that question of you again. Alexis?
Yes. My next question is not loaded. My next question is, when it comes to the housing crisis and gentrification, what means are you going to take to ensure that those harmed and in need of reparations most are afforded accessible support and resources?
I'm sorry, Alexis, can you just repeat that again, please?
When it comes to the housing crisis and gentrification, what means are you going to take to ensure that the most harmed and in need of reparations are afforded accessible support and resources?
Thank you. And I'll tell you, I'm going to answer, I'll be more than happy to answer a question or two, but I got to flip the script on you Rough Riders for a moment. And I'm going to flip the script because we got 22 days left. And the distinctions between my candidacy and myself are crystal clear. And I'm telling good folks like yourself, who I know love this community and love building community and care about these issues like Alexis' question, housing, the tires have been kicked. You should know your candidate by now. We've had countless forums and I had them all day long. And I'm telling folks, the reason why Seattle is so screwed up right now, homeless camps everywhere, small businesses going, is because people are watching and kicking tires and not active. So many of you have been active in my campaign. I thank you for that. But I, quite frankly, as a member of the community, I can only take so much, because I'm telling folks that the time for evaluating this was 6, 7, 8 months ago. We got to win this election. Now, let me answer your question directly. We have 65 strategies and in a deep dive work that we did to look at affordability. It was called the Hollow Work, Housing Affordability and Livability Advisory Committee, because we know that Seattle is way too expensive. The fact is, we're the 8th most expensive city living in the country, that our county is one of the most expensive counties. We now are at 750,000 people. In 1990, we had 519,000. In 1980, we had 400,000 plus. So we have this exponential growth, and we have high wage earners now have lived in Seattle and are pricing out people. The good news is that there are policies by which we could slow that growth and drive down the affordability of housing, but not just housing, the price of bread and eggs and milk and the other staples by which we can afford to live in Seattle. So I can't answer that in a minute or two, because we have come up with 65 types of recommendations. I did a deep dive on here because my mother and father got priced out of Seattle. I got skin in the game here. So an example will be, we will increase density in housing to lower the price around transit-oriented development. I do not support the total elimination of single-family zoning. My opponent does. I do not think that is the right approach. I think that we have hundreds of thousands of zoning capacity where it makes sense. And I think we need to also convert apartment buildings into condominium ownership, and we have to change the state laws to make it easier for people to own something. The transfer of generational wealth from a house, from a home to from a house to another person is one of the most significant ways, particularly the African-American community and others can transfer wealth. So I think we treasure that. But we build density, and we take the money to force the developers to spend into affordable housing. So into that work, we produce $50 million in affordable housing. I think we again look at the regulatory process that developers go through, the design reviews process sometimes takes 2 or 3 years. I think we need to accelerate that, get that down to 6 months, which we will do under my administration. That will drive the cost down. I also think the cheapest way to keep someone in the house is to do that, keep them in the house. So I want to give them below market loans to be able to put detached dwelling units or mother-in-law apartments on their property if they're so inclined, so they can enjoy rental income. I want to make sure property tax exemptions are increased such that people on fixed income or lower or moderate income can not get gouged in their tax bills that they pay. We will increase the production of housing to lower the cost in a lot of areas where it continues to make sense. Now, I just named 4 or 5 strategies, but truly they are 65. I could also talk about the work I've done in recidivism, make sure that people coming out of jail. I was the one that passed the law to ban the box in the city. That was my sole sponsored legislation, because people coming out right now of the penitentiary, we don't want them to recidivate. We want to remove the barriers for them to get into home ownership as well. I will also, and I'll just start on this one because I could talk a long time on affordable housing, is you look at what Microsoft's doing. They put up $500 million for below market rate interest loans for people to either stay in their house or to build housing, but they're not spending that money in Seattle. That's all on the east side. I'm going to get that money and make sure that these large, wealthy corporations pour money into our city. This is going to be a jobs fair. I want to make sure we retain jobs, but I want those large, wealthy corporations to spend their money in our city, helping us with our most important problems, which is homelessness and housing. So you're going to see me double down on those efforts to make sure that their profits, Amazon, for example, $17 million an hour in revenue. I'm going to make sure that their money goes back into the hands of our people such that we can afford to live in this city. We're going to be pretty aggressive on our housing policies.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move to the next section, and it has everything to do with education. So our question number 12, I'm going to let Natalia introduce herself and ask the question of you. Natalia?
Yes, hi. I'm Natalia. I'm on the PTSA at Roosevelt High School. And my first question is promoting racial equity in schools and closing race-based opportunity gaps requires collaboration between stakeholders. The current relationship between the City of Seattle and Seattle Public Schools seems very adversarial. How would you foster constructive dialogue about racial equity between the city, the superintendent, and the school board?
That's a good question. Very good question. So full disclosure, the new superintendent, Dr. Brent Jones, I was his lawyer who negotiated his contract for the Seattle Public Schools. And I think I shared with you, I'm the product of Seattle Public Schools. So the relationship is frazzled. And I think that one of the challenges on the school board is not necessarily that they're not fine human beings, that I believe they are, but they don't have many resources to succeed. They're managing $1 billion budget that the administration can, and by the way, I was PTSA very active in my daughters that graduated from Cleveland High School several years ago. My wife and I were part of their, part of the PTSA and auction shares to make sure we raise money. And work with the Cleveland Alumni Association. So what we're going to do in terms of the relationships is I'm going to meet with each board member and the superintendent. And I talk to them frequently, the current board, and I'm actually supporting a couple of new board members. We've got some good talent coming out, by the way. And I'm going to figure out what resources do they need. Do they need staff resources? Do they need administrative help? How do they get more accurate information from the administration? Because the administration sometimes hides information to the board. They're dysfunctional, and in terms of us working with the school board, we are separate. We are elected separately. So I do not think the city should control it at all. I think we just have to give them the ancillary resources and let them shine. We also, though, through our levy and through our Office of Education, currently run by Dwayne Chappelle, who is a Rainier Beach graduate and an outstanding leader, what we must do is sort of do the ancillary work, make sure these kids are fed, make sure they are warm, make sure that they have healthcare needs, make sure we're addressing the homelessness issue. So those wraparound services to help the kids and the teachers succeed, we can do that. That's the city's role. But in terms of governing, I think I just make sure they have the tools to succeed. So I have to meet them where they are. And quite frankly, I will lead that work. Those board of directors school board positions are thankless. And you have to have really a hard goal to do that kind of work. So I want to make sure that I meet with them frequently, regularly, and I give them the resources that they need.
Thank you. Natalia, you have the next question also, so you're on.
Thank you. What does achieving racial equity in schools look like to you? And what do you see as the role of the City of Seattle in working towards this goal?
Well, I'm sorry, Natalia, the last person, and what do I see what?
And what do you see as the role of the City of Seattle in working towards the goal of racial equity?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for repeating the question. So equity, I'm probably a result of equity at the right time. I mean, I went to Garfield and I was accepted to Harvard and Stanford and Yale, and my parents didn't even go to college. As a result of making sure that the district at that time poured the right resources, had the right teachers, gave me, and realized that perhaps I did not have the resources of a child graduating from Lakeside or one of the top independent schools, that they recognized that perhaps I, a lot of kids by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade are already behind. And that's, so equity to me looks like between 0 to 4 in terms of brain development, that we do everything humanly possible to make sure that child is at level, at least at reading level in the 3rd or 4th grade, that they are not in the 6th or 7th or 8th grade playing catch-up ball. Equity realizes that even with that, kids in middle school may not have the resource to have a tutor, or may not even have a state-of-the-art computer, may need Wi-Fi or technology to advance as other kids with higher means may have. Equity means that even a kid that graduates with a 2.7, 2.8 GPA might be as talented as a kid that graduated with a 3.9 GPA, because it took more for this kid to get to 2.7 than it did for the kid to get a 3.9. And so we have to recognize, we have to give that kid still the opportunity to succeed. That's why I started the Seattle Promise, to make sure kids could go to a school a 13th year, because they didn't have the financial means. Perhaps English was a second language. This is work in equity, all which I've started, and quite frankly, I've been doing my entire life. That's what equity looks like. Equity looks like, it is not equality. It is realizing that we're dealing with 400 years of institutional racism. And I will tell you this, and I'm not shy about this, and some people on this call have worked with me in nonprofit organizations. And I've said this, and I own this, that I don't blame white people for a lot of the issues, that I can blame them for looking at institutional practice or institutional racism. But I've just found out that in doing a lot of that kind of work, that I may not be able to accurately capture the power within the room that I might be able to tap into as well. So in other words, while we recognize historical trends of racism, we also tap into the resources within the room. And through that process, we have a very holistic approach toward empowerment. And that's how we achieve equity, that we don't, we're not as reactive as we are proactive. And I believe Seattle gets this. I believe Seattle understands that there are historical racial practices that we have to address and admit, but we also have to realize that the path forward might be all hands on deck. Everyone helps us. We look at who's in the room and we see how we could also help ourselves in the process. To me, that's equity.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. The next question is from Maggie Lewis. And her question is, what should the City of Seattle do to support before and after school programs for K-8 students? As mayor, what means would you use to listen to the voices of students and teachers to learn about their needs in school?
I'm sorry, Najee. My Wi-Fi, it went in and out. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that one more time?
Yes, absolutely. This is from Maggie Lewis. What should the City of Seattle do to support before and after school programs for K-8 students? As mayor, what means would you use to listen to the voices of students and teachers to learn about their needs in school?
So before and after school, K-8, that's a critical time for kids to make sure that, number one, they are adequately, their health needs are adequately met. And after school, there where kids have some free time, many of them will have idle hands and it may not be as productive as we'd like it to be. So this again, where the city of Seattle, using its recreation centers and using all of its ancillary resources, can make sure that we have a safety net and activity, positive activity and learning resources for them to thrive. That is truly this role the city can play. To make sure that I think the last part of the question is, how do we
listen to the voices of students and teachers.
And this is where I think the school district, between the student councils and between physically being present at schools, making sure our Office of Education has the structure around listening to the students and the teachers, that we have to meet the students and the teachers where they are. We can't expect them to come down to city council. We do have a student council where we, bring out some of the student leaders to city council and have them do policy work. But I think the city needs to meet the kids and the teachers where they are in the schools. And so you'll see a strong presence of the city in the schools listening and making sure that their needs are met. And that's, quite frankly, that's pretty exciting. I spend a lot of time in schools already, and I look forward to that work.
Okay, thank you. The next question is question number 15, and it's going to be from Sarah Swanberg, and she will ask the question herself.
Hi, I'm Sarah Swanberg. I'm the chair of the Race and Equity Committee at Roosevelt High School. Oh shoot, can you put my question in the chat? Thank you. Got me covered there. So in Seattle, schools in wealthier, wider neighborhoods have public schools with PTSAs that raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for their schools. In schools south of Ship Canal, in areas affected by redlining, PTSAs raise very little. For example, schools with active PTSAs can buy tents so their kids can eat outdoors during COVID. Schools without funds could be forced to have their kiddos eat inside and risk COVID spread. As mayor, how will you work to lessen this disparity between the well-funded and the less funded public schools?
So this is actually some work that I've done personally, and I have some ideas on what the city could do. And personally, when my daughter attended Cleveland High School, I think their PTSA through their auction was raising maybe $2,000 or $3,000. And so my wife and I then became the chairs of the auction committee and figure out ways to raise $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, still realizing some schools at Garfield and others were raising hundreds of thousands of dollars and auctioning Teslas and things of that nature. And that's where I became aware of the huge disparity between student PTSA organization fundraising, which goes directly to the kids and teachers, and how critical that is. So the city could help put structure around that many of the parents are very busy people at some of the underrepresented schools, and many of them are having 2 jobs, but the city can put structure around that. And I believe that parents in other schools may help out as well. So what that may look like are fundraising efforts, again, tapping into these wealthy corporations, them realizing that, that an education on one side of the city should be a standard of excellence, as should they all be on the other side of the city. So we are going to, again, measure the disparities in schools. We're going to try to come up with a unifying effort to beef up the PTSA efforts in all of the schools, put structure around it. And of course, I'm glad you all at Roosevelt are talking about this. I'm very aware of Roosevelt's robotics program and their music program and their rich academic programs. And even by virtue of your alumni organization, I'm aware of the great work you all do. But again, at some other schools, we just don't have that kind of infrastructure. So our Office of Education will develop a plan by which we'll put structure around this to have better achievements in equity.
Thank you. Okay, we have time, I believe, for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. And this is question number 16, and you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about all the young fellows who raised their hand about who plays golf. But this question is from Tim Hennings, and it reads, when we were young, we attempted to achieve racial integration through busing. We can't do busing now, and we are just as segregated as we were 50 years ago. What can we do to encourage our youth, especially students of different races, to come together through activities outside of school athletics?
Yeah, good question. You know, I was actually, I don't know if many of you know this, I was actually bused to Eckstein my 8th grade year. I remember that day I was going to Meany Middle School, and all of a sudden my parents said, guess what, you're going to Eckstein. And I said, what? Eckstein, where's that? And we were all bused out to Eckstein. So I do remember those days. And then from Eckstein, I went to Garfield. We need to, first of all, the issue should be that every school, first of all, I'm a big believer in STEM programs. I just have to put that out there, that I'm also a believer that all of our schools should have a standard of excellence such that when we look at where a kid goes to school, it becomes seamless. So I think that is our goal. Take Franklin High School as an example. They have they're doing some marvelous things in terms of their academic rigor and some of the scholars that they are producing. So I'm confident that with the right leadership, the right investment strategy, looking at best practices, helping our teachers, which is, again, is an underappreciated, underpaid occupation, that we will reach a level to where it doesn't make any difference what school the kid goes to. So that's sort of my goal, not so much the busing or the demographics. I continue to tell, I think many of you would agree with this, that some of the best learning you can have is when you are in diverse learning situations, that you don't want to be homogenous in any way. And so I'm confident that when we raise the standards to, and I'm not being idealistic, I believe when we raise the academic standards in our school district, and we will, that you're going to see kids from all over wanting to be part of something good in other parts of the city. There's just too many scholars being, I mean, I know young people, particularly a few young women come to mind that from Rainier Beach went right to Yale. And so we are producing some good scholars, but it's not as universal as we want to see it, but I'm confident we'll get there. And then that's how we'll get people wanting to go to schools from all over the city.
Thank you. Okay, so we have covered personal questions, and then we talked a little bit about City of Seattle and government, and then housing, education. This is one final question for you, Bruce, and that is question number 20.
20 questions, my goodness.
Well, actually we have 22, but we're gonna end with this 20. And I think that you've covered it all, but this is one that has to do with the workplace, social, and community engagement. So the question is, I have witnessed companies, boards, advisory groups struggle to increase diversity, in parentheses, race, culture, sexual orientation, etc. What strategies or practices can you recommend to help in attracting people of color and sending the message they are welcome?
That's a really good question. Well, you know, I took the SHRM exam. I don't know if any of you have done much in HR. It's a Senior Certified Human Resource Management test to understand more about human resource principles, to answer that kind of question. How do you attract the best of the best and still achieve the diversity that you really seize? And I think that it has all to do with, number one, making sure who's evaluating the candidate are culturally competent, that the bias, either implicit bias or just flat out bias that we have, every human being has it. We just do. And I think the first part is to make sure that when you evaluate anyone for jobs and opportunity, that the evaluators are trained appropriately to understand their bias and to make sure that we are measuring against it. I recommended one time during I think it was police and fire exams, that you videotape the oral examination piece, because, you know, let's say, for example, I'll just be hypothetical, that if 3 guys are evaluating a woman, they may have certain prejudgments about this woman, have certain expectations. Well, another woman may evaluate the person and have a whole new set of eyes looking at that person. And it's not to say that the three guys are bad. It's just that we have this implicit bias. And so we have to figure out a way to remove the bias in the evaluation process, number one. Number two, we always want to make sure we are recruiting in the right areas, that we're doing our outreach, and whether it's HBCUs or civil rights organizations or underrepresented groups, that we're recruiting in the right, so using the right social media, and our outreach, bar none, is very inclusive. And I think sometimes on both of those steps, we miss the mark a little bit.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that concludes our session. Joe, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close us out.
Okay. Well, again, Bruce, thanks a lot for taking the time out. I believe all of our participants on this open discussion got a great deal of information about you personally, and about the programs that you have in mind in order to make the city of Seattle a greater place for all people. Okay, so with that, thanks a lot. Take care.
Roosevelt, thank you for spending your evening with me. I really enjoyed all of you, and I hope I could earn your support here on November 2nd. Thank you. Go Rough Riders and Bulldogs.
Go Bulldogs, right?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Steve, has Miss Gonzalez, has she signed on?
She has not, unless she's got a campaign manager that came in or somebody else on her staff. I haven't seen her name pop up.
Okay. Okay. I did send her at,
Gonzalez was just admitted.
okay. Mrs. Gonzalez.
Hello, good evening.
Okay. Okay. You're going to put her up, Steve? Okay.
Yes, I'm looking for her in the boxes.
Here, I'll raise my hand.
Thank you. You know Zoom very well.
Okay, there you go.
There we go.
Okay. First of all, thank you for participating in this open discussion with RARE and our supporters. We appreciate that. And thanks again. We got started a little late, and so we appreciate your patience and coming on 10 minutes later than what we originally had planned with that. Okay, but we do want to thank you for agreeing to participate. We realize how busy you are. We're going to have two moderators for tonight. One is Teska Hatch, and the other one is Naja Brown. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome, Lorena. Do you want to be called Lorena or Mrs. Gonzalez?
Lorena's fine.
Okay, thank you. So I have a disclaimer that I'm going to read, and it reads as this. RARE, as a nonprofit charity, does not support or oppose individual candidates running for public office. RARE invited both candidates for mayor of the city of Seattle to speak to our group for educational purposes. So our goal is for both candidates to be asked the same questions and given equal time. We'll see how that goes. We had to adjust a little bit, 45 minutes ago, but our goal is to work through at least the majority of the 22 questions that we have, and we've divided them up into categories. And so with that, I will go ahead and start with the personal questions section. And this is the question: how has your ethnic heritage prepared you for life in general, including your journey into politics?
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of you. It's getting close to bedtime for my 1.5-year-old, so you might hear some screeching in the background any minute now. So appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. My name is Lorena Gonzalez. I am honored to have an opportunity to be running to be Seattle's next mayor. So for me, I am the daughter of immigrants who originally came to this country from Michoacan, Mexico in the late 60s, originally as undocumented immigrants, and settled in the lower Yakima Valley, where my family and I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters. We all grew up as migrant farm workers. So I actually earned my first paycheck at the young age of 8 years old, picking cherries just about a mile north of where I grew up and where my mom still lives. So I have grown up in this country as a first-generation American, as a woman of color, and now as a first-time mom. And so that has really shaped all of the work that I have done the entirety of my career. Whether it's being a civil rights attorney in our state, which I did for about 10 years before becoming a city council member, worked as a civil rights attorney representing women, people of color, children, families, the elderly, and others in a variety of civil rights cases, including police misconduct, police brutality, employment discrimination, wage theft, and other kinds of labor cases and elder abuse cases, to really hold some of the most powerful interests in that system accountable for injustice against members of our community who don't usually have access to justice. And I have translated that work into my role as a council member. And as a council member, I have championed policies that help working parents, people of color, and workers and working families generally by advancing labor standards that respect our time, that honor our work, that compensate us appropriately, and that protect our children and women across the city by making sure that they have access to childcare and to early learning opportunities, into a pathway into vocation or college through our educational programming at the city. So it has really shown up for me. My identity has shown up for me in all of my work since the first day that I started working in the fields in Central Washington to today, where I, really pride myself on the opportunity to center those who are furthest away from justice in all of my decision-making and in how I choose to use my time and for whom I choose to dedicate time to.
Thank you. Thank you. Question number 3. There has been a lot of racial tension in the last year and a half. Based on your personal experience, what words of encouragement would you offer for someone who is still struggling in the midst of racism and has lost hope?
Well, I would encourage that person to channel our energy collectively towards restoring hope in having an opportunity to have shared prosperity and greater equity in our city and beyond. It is a very dark time for many communities of color right now. COVID didn't create the inequities, but they certainly shined a light on many of the racial disparities, particularly in the area of the wealth gap and how we can shelter in place. But I think that I am actually really hopeful about the future of our city. I think we have an opportunity to center working families, those who have been most disproportionately impacted by racism and systems that perpetuate oppression. And we have an opportunity through this election for mayor to change that and to not go back to policies of the past, but to really focus on how we can build back better, and how we can do that by centering workers, by centering working families, and by making sure that every investment we are making is in the best interest of a vast majority of our families across the city, as opposed to supporting systems that are only benefiting the wealthy and the most elite folks who enjoy a lot of prosperity and enjoyed a lot more prosperity during this last year of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. The next question, number 4, is from Reginald Ball. And his question is, where should the starting point be to introduce the reality of racial equity? School, home, visual or print media, or all of the above?
I think it's in all of the above when we're talking about creating equity throughout our entire society. I don't think we can leave any tool on the table, as they say. We have to really make sure that we appreciate the fact that people receive information and learn in different ways, and create those opportunities and those welcoming environments for people to be challenged, certainly, about their own biases and their own potential, racist sentiments. And so I think it's an all hands on deck kind of approach to really sort of make sure that we equip families with the tools that they need to be able to talk about race is really important. We can do that through programming at our Seattle Public Schools, and certainly at our Seattle Public Libraries, for example, that really do create those community hubs and opportunities for people to have those productive conversations. But we can also lead as leaders, as people in our community who are trusted within our communities about what it means to challenge our own assumptions about race, and how we can work together to break down and dismantle those institutional systems that have perpetuated racism for far too long, that leave so many of our communities of color out of an opportunity for prosperity.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we're going to make a segue into questions that have everything to do with the city of Seattle and or government. And the first question in this section is question number 5, and we're going to let Alexis ask the question of you herself. Alexis?
Hi, my name is Alexis Brew. I'm a member of the NAACP Youth Council, as well as Washington Ethics Studies Now. My question is, what measures of accountability do you plan to enforce for people in leadership roles of power, like public office, the police force, etc., who have harmed people of color and or perpetuated racist and discriminatory behaviors and systems?
Big question. Thank you, Alexis. So I think we do have a race and social justice equity initiative at the city that was passed some years ago. I'll have to be honest with you that there's been sort of inequitable application of that program, in large part because it was sort of structured as a goal and a vision statement without any sort of real resources or enforcement of how we are going to measure progress on racial equity and dismantling systems of oppression and racism. So I think it's really important for the next mayor to not just issue an executive order reaffirming our racial equity goals, but to really hold our directors accountable to specific metrics around what will be expected in terms of achieving success for communities of color. And so for me, it's not just about cutting widgets, it's about seeing the results in our community, right? So when we're talking about our Department of Education and Early Learning, are we seeing greater numbers of children of color who've been historically excluded from our early learning program and our child care program getting more access and actually graduating and being ready for kindergarten and going through the system of the Seattle Public School system in a way that leads them to college or to a vocational training where they make a good living wage job? So we got to be focused on those outcomes for our families that are going to be a critical indicator as to whether or not we are really moving the needle on producing racial equity. I think that's the biggest accountability metric we can aspire to. We tend to, at the city, get into the habit of counting widgets. In other words, how many people of color did we talk to? How many, talks did we have? How many community conversations did we have? And those things, I'm not saying aren't important, but really it's not about the how many of X did we do. It's about what outcomes are we actually producing that result in greater access to being able to graduate from school, to being able to have a healthy life, to continue to have affordable housing and housing stability, to continue to be able to have access to healthcare. These are the things that I would be interested in championing as the next mayor, and in holding our leaders of each of the departments accountable to producing those outcomes in a way that's clear and transparent to members of our community who have, again, been furthest away from access and opportunity and shared prosperity.
Thank you. So question number 6 is from Bruce Williams, and you sort of answered it, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because there's one part that you might be able to focus on. If you were mayor, do you think you can make a meaningful difference in Seattle's racial equity climate during your term in office? If so, how will you do that? So maybe you sort of answered that, but this is the second part of that question. What will be the biggest barriers?
Oh my goodness. So I did kind of already veer into this area, but I think, I think I'll focus maybe on what the biggest barriers are to that vision that I just described. And listen, I've been working for the city now for 6 years. And one of the things that is the most frustrating to me is hearing no, as in like, we can't do that because we've never done it that way before. And so I think bureaucracy sometimes can get in the way of good intentions of wanting to produce the outcomes that we know are going to be good for our residents. And so I think the challenge is sort of how do we create an environment for new talent and existing talent at the city to really feel like they are empowered to do transformational work. And I think folks who work at the city are really hungry for that opportunity. They want a leader who's going to say, look, I'm going to give you the resources that you need. I'm going to make sure that your work is fairly compensated. A lot of times diversity work or racial equity work is expected to be done for free. And I think, I think our employees are staunch public servants and really want to be able to fulfill the mission of creating a more just and equitable community for us all. And the biggest barrier is sort of how do we cultivate that culture in every single department and allow people to feel that they are supported and that this isn't sort of a extracurricular activity, but that it is critical to the core mission of who we are as a city, and that, our services are falling short if we are not centering racial equity in every single, service and work that we do as city employees.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to make a transition to questions that have to do with housing. And this is a hot topic in Seattle. And I'm going to let question number 8 be asked by Alexis again. And so Alexis, excuse me, you're up.
Yes, thank you. Next question is, when it comes to the housing crisis and gentrification, what means are you going to take to ensure that the most harmed and in need of reparations are afforded accessible support and resources?
I think we have a choice in a couple of areas. One is we have a choice to identify how much resources we're going to prioritize for affordable housing and for whom. And I think that really the area that I really want to explore is creating wealth opportunities for communities of color by really focusing on displaced families, strategies that allow for affordable home ownership, for example. So one of the things that I've been talking a lot to folks about is a lease to own home ownership program that could be funded by the city of Seattle that could really create that pathway for folks to actually buy a home and convert themselves from being a lifelong renter to being a homeowner and start accumulating wealth in that way. For me, this has been transformative. I had an opportunity to buy my own condo in 2011 during the peak of the buyer's market, and it is my retirement egg. It is what I will rely on when I decide to retire from my professional career, and it's what's going to sustain me and my family in this very hot real estate market. So that dream is elusive to many of us in communities of color, and I think that's wrong. And as mayor, I want to be able to work towards creating those pathways to allow people to break the cycles of poverty by actually being able to own a home of their choice, whether it's a condo in my case, or a townhome, or a single family home, or an apartment, whatever the case might be. I think we need to do more to create those pathways. Additionally, our funding and our programming needs to be designed around strong anti-displacement strategies. We can do that by creating community land trusts that allow communities of color to pool their resource and go in it together to purchase big swaths of land and to actually do a community development project that is built by the community and for the community, and creates an opportunity for community preference, which is the policy that says that if you have been displaced from a particular neighborhood, you kind of get the first right of refusal. I'm sort of shortcutting this and simplifying it, but you get a first right of refusal to come back to your community where you've been displaced from, to be able to live in that new community development. So those are the kind of strategies that I'm really interested in to, once again, center those communities who are at greatest risk of displacement and who have been already displaced from our community, to welcome them back into the city and make sure that we continue to be a city that is going to be diverse in terms of our socioeconomic status and our racial diversity.
Thank you. Okay, so this question sort of touches on what you've already talked about, but it has a different twist, and I'm going to ask it. It's question number 11, and it's from Ruby Holland. You want to focus all of Seattle's growth on areas already upzoned. These areas were previously redlined and give a pass to white areas that had racially restrictive covenants. Please explain how this is equitable.
It's not. So I am a large proponent of housing choice across the city of Seattle. In years past, way before I arrived on the scene, there was a decision made, I believe it was in the 90s. So I was just, graduating from college/high school back then, that really focused the city's growth strategy on urban villages. So that has unfortunately resulted in a situation where about 80% of the city's growth is funneled into 12% of our residential land. And for me, I'm running for mayor because I want to create a city that is not exclusive and available to only the wealthiest among us. In order to do that, we need to significantly reform our zoning laws. And that does mean looking at areas of the city of Seattle that are strictly prohibited from accepting anything other than single family homes, which are the most expensive type of housing in our city, running at about $850,000 on average. In most neighborhoods. And so I think for me as mayor, I see the path of being able to create a more affordable city, a city that is more inclusive, a city that is more climate friendly, by increasing our density in every single neighborhood in the city of Seattle, including those neighborhoods where right now it is currently illegal to have multifamily housing, as a key strategy to combating inequality and to creating greater housing choice. That has to be paired with strong policies that I just discussed around anti-displacement and anti-gentrification, so that we can make sure that as we are increasing housing choice and density in our most attractive neighborhoods, that people of color who have been displaced or at risk of being displaced are being prioritized in terms of access and opportunity to move into those very neighborhoods that we are, we're going to be building to be more inclusive and available to communities that have historically been excluded from those neighborhoods because of these horrible redlining policies that we continue to deal with the vestiges of those policies, even though they're not technically on the books anymore. We are still dealing with those vestiges of redlining. The last thing I'll say is that a couple of years ago, I worked with the current council members to advance a study to look at the racial equity impacts of how our urban village growth strategy is impacting racial disproportionality and lack of access to communities of color to really prosperous areas within our city. And that study confirmed the theory in your question, which is that our urban village strategy shares a lot of similarities with the redlining zones of the past, and has in fact exacerbated many of the racial inequities in terms of housing choice and where it's available throughout our city.
Okay, thank you. So the next subject or topic is going to be on education. And for question number 12, we're going to let Natalia ask you the question herself. And please remember to identify who you are and with what organization you are affiliated. And let me just say that Alexis, who asked a couple of questions, she's with the NAACP Youth Council. I don't think she said that, so just to put that plug in for her. Okay, Natalia, question number 12.
Hi, I'm Natalia Yudkowsky. I am on the board of the Roosevelt High School PTSA. My question is, promoting racial equity in schools and closing race-based opportunity gaps requires collaboration between stakeholders. The current relationship between the City of Seattle and Seattle Public Schools seems very adversarial. How would you foster constructive dialogue about racial equity between the city, the superintendent, and the school board?
Great question. So I, as a city council member, have been the chair of the city council's committee responsible for education, which includes our relationship with the Seattle Public Schools. And I have to say that I've really enjoyed a positive relationship with many of the school board members. I'm endorsed in this race by several of the school board members. And I think that's because I have really worked hard as a city council member responsible for education policy at the legislative department to really focus on building those bridges of communication and relationship, so that when there are questions that arise about how we're going to invest or where we're going to invest or potential policy changes related to our educational levy, I have a direct channel to folks who are decision makers over at the Seattle Public Schools to really talk through any unintended consequences. And I think it's really important for the city to have a strong relationship. A lot of times we think about the relationship between the city and our schools as being just about how do we support the K through 12 system. But the reality is that the Seattle Public School System has been a great partner to the city of Seattle in the early learning space as well. And so we have a partnership where we co-locate many of our early learning centers. Our Seattle preschool program that includes both, that includes all children of all abilities that are co-located in many of the buildings at the Seattle Public Schools. And so I think, I am incredibly invested as somebody who is the direct product of Head Start and early learning programs to make sure that our relationship is on the strongest footing possible, because that's what's good for our kids. As the mom of a 1.5-year-old who plans on sending her kids to public school, my kid to public school, like I want to make sure that our public schools feel that they are supported and that they have what the support they need from us at the city to make sure that they can continue to address the educational needs of those who are furthest away from educational justice.
Okay, and that's a good segue into Natalia's next question, question number 13. Natalia.
Thanks. What does achieving racial equity in schools look like to you? And what do you see as the role of the city of Seattle in working towards this goal?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the racial equity, what it looks like to me as a kid who also went to public school and struggled in our public school system, is to see more of our kids graduating from high school. We have to see our kids, be in a position where they're actually graduating from high school, and that they are doing that in a way that is equitable. And right now that is not the case. And part of that is because we are failing our kids further upstream. Our kids who are brown, Black, and Indigenous are are not ready for kindergarten most of the time. That's why I'm such a huge believer in our early learning programs, to get further upstream and invest in their readiness, so that on day one, they show up to their kindergarten class ready to learn. That's a critical strategy to ensure that all of the investments we provide to our children through the K through 12 system result in graduation and in the possibility of our children either choosing a vocation, because college isn't for everybody, or in pursuing a college education. So, I was the prime sponsor of the renewal of the Families Education Preschool and Promise program that really did make those investments along the spectrum. And I have been, a big champion in making sure that we are ensuring that our kids are ready for kindergarten on day one, supported through the K through 12 system, and have a pathway to career or college once they're ready to graduate from our public schools. And I'm going to continue to invest in those programs as both, because I just think that making sure that our kids can graduate from high school is a critical indicator of whether or not our educational investments are working.
Thank you. Now, question number 14 is from Maggie Lewis, and I think you sort of touched on it, but I think this question is going to allow you to drill down a little bit more. What should the city of Seattle do to support before and after school programs for K through 8 students? As mayor, what means would you use to listen to the voices of students and teachers to learn about their needs in school?
Yeah, I think, our Families in Education Preschool Promise Levy is really critical to supporting some of the before and after school programs and some of the summer programming as well. A lot of our kids don't have access to regular meals, for example, and our Families in Education Preschool Promise Levy does really invest in those sort of gap areas where kids would otherwise be hungry or go without if we weren't supporting some of these food programs and other programs. So I think I'm a big believer in the family support workers that are housed within our schools as sort of a connector to programs and services available to many of our kids and their families. And we need to continue to invest in the family support workers who are really critical to making sure that students and their families have access to the resources and the programs they need so that they can focus on learning and not have to worry about where they're going to get their next meal, whether they're going to have a warm bed to sleep in, or any other issues they might be having at home. So I think having programs before and after school that promote that sort of overall healthiness of the family and the student, so that a student can really focus once they show up and get their seat in butt, as they say, their butt in that seat, that they are really ready to just focus on learning. And so that means, addressing their hunger issues before they get into the classroom. It means making sure that they have equitable access to transportation, which is a huge issue for so many of our kids right now and their families, is the bus system. And it also means making sure that after school, we are connecting people with positive programming so that they aren't, subject to negative behavior that can really derail our kids from continuing to stay engaged in school and in positive behavior. And these are all things that we need to have really strong relationships with a lot of our community service providers and organizations and PTSAs and other folks to make sure that we understand what school specific needs are. And I think the mayor's role is to really empower the Department of Education and Early Learning, and to have strong relationships with the Seattle Public School Superintendent, board members, and parents at those schools, to really get a clear understanding of whether our investments are targeted investments are having the impact that is going to be necessary to address those outside needs to promote the learning, the healthy learning of all our kids once they're in the K through 8 system.
Okay, Thank you. So the next question is question number 15, and Sarah is going to ask you this question herself. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Swanberg. I'm the chair of the Race and Equity Committee at Roosevelt, which is part of the PTSA. And my question is,
Is it in the chat?
Yeah, it's in there. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
It's a long one.
I know, it's kind of long. In Seattle, schools in wealthier, wider neighborhoods have public schools with PTSAs that raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for their schools. In schools south of Ship Canal, in areas affected by redlining, PTSAs raise very little. For example, schools with active PTSAs can buy tents so their kids can eat outdoors during COVID. Schools without funds could be forced to have their kiddos eat inside and risk COVID spread. As a mayor, how will you work to lessen this disparity between the well-funded and the less funded public schools? Thanks.
Thank you. So, I think again, the area where we have resources to leverage in this space is the Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy. Again, we lead that work with a strong racial equity lens, which means that we prioritize our dollars on Title I schools, which are the schools who are in less wealthier areas of the city. That was an important strategy that we crafted together with stakeholders within the education system, not just administrators and school board members, but actual students and parents that are served by those levy dollars, which are designed to really create enrichment opportunities for our student population. And so I think, the next mayor has to stay committed to centering those schools that are the ones that don't have access to the resources through private fundraising by virtue of PTSA structures. And we also need to have strong relationships with our community-based organizations that are trusted trusted messengers in many of our low-income communities, and make sure that they have an opportunity to be co-located within many of our schools that are that are in historically redlined areas, who really do look to those community-based organizations for information and for trust purposes. I had an opportunity a few years ago to visit some of our Title I schools that were going to benefit from the Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy. And, one of the schools I went to was the school in South Park, where I had an opportunity to really go in and talk to students and their teachers and their administrators about why it was so important for the city of Seattle to stay committed to a Title I lens and approach, because these are the schools that don't historically have these organizations around PTSAs that supplement the budget privately. I'll end my response here by saying that I also think that the mayor plays a really important role in continuing to advocate and be the chief lobbyist for our students in Olympia, and making sure that we are looking at how we can continue to address the inequities in how our public education system is funded in a manner that really does meet the needs of those schools who have significant number of kids who are just really struggling to have any sort of success in our education system. And I think that we have an opportunity to, tell our stories as parents and students in this city, to legislators in Olympia, that really give them the tools necessary to advocate on behalf of our families, and really continue to, make change to the inequitable way in which we currently fund our public school systems. And, we're still dealing with the impacts of McLaren, and how that, that has in some cases further exacerbated some of the educational justice issues that we have historically had in the Seattle public school system.
Thank you. Okay, we're still in the education section and I have one or two more questions. This one is question number 16 from Tim Hennings. When we were young, we attempted to achieve racial integration through busing. We can't do busing now, and we are just as segregated as we were 50 years ago. What can you do to encourage our youth, especially students of different races, to come together through activities outside of school athletics?
I really like this question, mostly because I've never really been an athlete. So whenever there's these, come play volleyball or basketball thing, I'm like, sure, I'll try it, but I'm really bad at it. I think, meeting kids where they're at and their talents is really important. And, I think there's a lot of power in arts and culture programming, for example. I was also not good at music, for the record. Tried the flute for about 2 weeks and then returned that thing right away because I was so bad at it. But I do think that, arts and culture, right, whether it's drama, whether it's intergenerational programming, there's a really great program at our Seattle Parks and Recreation department that our Seattle Parks and Recreation department runs that really focuses on intergenerational opportunities. So seniors and young kids coming together, and I had an opportunity to participate in one of those like a couple years ago in the Lake City neighborhood. And it was just really amazing to see kids who spoke one language, seniors that spoke a different language. There were translators available, and there was really this interconnectedness that created a lot of investment in who we are as a community. And so I'm a big believer in those intergenerational opportunities, the creative arts. And look, I think there's also a huge role that the city can play in creating youth employment opportunities that really, generate paid internships at the city for our youth, and that also create partnerships with good, responsible business partners in the city that want to, build and develop talent and create pathways to things like STEM and technology in our city is a really important role that the next mayor can play to really promote this value of racial integration amongst all of our residents across the city. And we got to start when folks are young. It's never too late to do racial integration, but I think starting when we're young is really important. And then I know this is not directly related to this question, but part of the reason why I'm a big proponent of having greater housing choice across the city is because I see that as a systemic way of addressing the realities of the lack of racial integration within our school system, right? If we allow our South Park kids to live in Laurelhurst because there's now affordable housing there and good transit and opportunity for working class families who live in South Park to now live in Laurelhurst, we're going to see a different kind of population, a different kind of student population at that school that really does promote racial integration in a way that I think is truer to who we are and who we want to be as a city.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you question number 18, and this is a question. What thoughts do you have for education leaders among various demographic groups for guiding their school communities through helpful conversations on equity and social justice?
In 2000 and I think it was 17, maybe in 18, one of my legislative aides came to me. She used to work at One America, and she did a lot of education work at the state level. And one of the things she told me is there's this, concept of teacher diversity that all of us are familiar with, but that we really don't resource. We don't invest actual dollars at the city in increasing the amount of diverse teachers from our own communities who look like our kids and sound like our kids. We should think about doing that. And I said, that sounds amazing. Let's do it. So that budget cycle, we became the first city in the nation to allocate funding to the Seattle public school system to focus specifically on teacher diversity, so that kids who are furthest away from educational justice, which are Black and brown folks in our school system, are learning and listening to people who look like them, who grew up like them, and who sound like them. And that has been really transformative in that system. And we went from doing a small investment of about $150,000 to baking it into our education levy. And now there is a consistent, stable revenue stream that has been investing in cohorts of diverse teachers who are going to work in our public school system and begin creating that racial equity. It is considered a best standard and a best practice. And after we did this investment, we got contacts from our state legislators saying, hey, could we get your legislation? Could we sort of learn from your research that you did at the city so that we can promote this opportunity through investments at the state level? And in fact, that's what has happened. And now the University of Washington has a program where they're investing in cohorts of diverse teachers who are in the best position to really talk to our students about racial equity and social justice. And so I'm a big proponent of making those investments in our communities of color to not just have them be the ones receiving information, but to be the leaders in our community and to be our stewards and our role models for our students as we continue this collective work around racial equity.
Okay. All right. Well, we are coming to a close nearly. We've got one more question. It's question number 20, and it's under the category of workplace and our social and our community engagement. And this is the question. I have witnessed companies, boards, advisory groups struggle to increase diversity, race, culture, sexual orientation, etc. What strategies or practices can you recommend to help in attracting people of color and sending the message they are welcome?
Yeah, I have to say, as I might have mentioned in my remarks earlier, I worked as an attorney in the city of Seattle for many years. And, one of the things that is very common in a lot of professions is creating these diversity committees or inclusion committees that unfortunately a lot of times are made up of the few people of color who are working at that company, who are then saddled with the burden of solving the company's or the institution's racial equity problems without any white folks on the committee, and with zero power and no resources and no ability to actually effectuate change. And that, that has been a personal experience of mine time and time and time again. And so I think, really what we have to do is acknowledge that people of color have been left out of professional opportunities for generations. And, if you're a woman of color, you have sort of the double whammy of both, being a woman and being a person of color, and are starting way behind, comparatively speaking, especially if you start looking at industries. And so the reality here is, and I'm a huge labor advocate. I'm widely supported by labor unions who represent essential workers in this city and in the region. And that's because I acknowledge that in order to really promote diversity and racial equity amongst our workforce, we have to pay people equitably. We cannot continue to have a gender wage gap where Black, Latina, and Indigenous women are paid cents on the dollar in comparison to our white male counterparts doing the same work. We have to acknowledge that we are generally, have a workforce that is unfriendly to people who want to have families, that doesn't provide us affordable access to healthcare universally, right? These are things that are really important to address if we are serious about incorporating and providing career paths to people of color within our organizations. And so, we just have to do the hard work of saying that we are gonna respect the work that people do, in particularly in industries that have overrepresentation of women, women of color, and people of color generally, like teachers and nurses and any kind of healthcare profession that isn't a doctor, or being a social worker, or being, part of our workforce that we tasked with the tough responsibility of addressing homelessness. These are all these are all industries in which people of color are overrepresented, and where wages continue to be stagnant and in the bottom third of compensation. So we have to do that hard work around wage studies and make sure that people are being compensated equitably for the work that they are doing. And we have to stop devaluing caretaking work and primary, caretaking work that is primarily done by people of color.
Okay. Thank you, Lorena, so much. We didn't hear the 1.5-year-old in the background, so she's probably.
My husband was a master at getting her to bed with very little noise.
Oh, well, thank you for giving us part of your family time. Let me just put it that way. And I'm going to thank you so much. This has been a pleasure to be able to hear from both you and Bruce. So we just want to thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Joe Hunter.
Okay. Well, again, Lorena, thanks a lot for taking time off from your very, very busy schedule, I know, to participate in this open discussion session with RARE, our board, and its supporters and so forth. It gave us great insight into you, the person, the individual, what you would do as the mayor of Seattle and some of the initiatives and so forth. And it makes me feel good about the future of the city of Seattle.